In quiet communities where nothing ever seems to happen, people often assume danger lives somewhere far away. But sometimes it builds slowly inside ordinary homes, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles, until one day it can no longer be ignored. The Harrow family lived in Pine Water County, a rural stretch in northern Oregon known for its dense forests and small lakefront properties. Their home sat near Lake Renford, a place locals described as peaceful, almost untouched. For years, neighbors saw the Harrows as just another private family keeping to themselves. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. That perception would later collapse completely. The family's story began decades earlier with Margaret Ellison, a woman who herself had been adopted as an infant. She grew up in foster care before being taken in permanently by an elderly couple who lived on the lake. When they passed away, she inherited their property and stayed in the same home, eventually building her life there. In her early 30s, Margaret adopted 2 boys from different backgrounds. The older one, Caleb, arrived first at age 4. A year later, she adopted his younger half-brother, Liam. The boys came from difficult circumstances, and at the time, Margaret believed giving them a stable home would change everything. For a while, it seemed to work. Caleb was quiet, observant, and struggled socially. Liam was the opposite. He was loud, reactive, and constantly testing boundaries. Teachers described him as intelligent but volatile, the kind of child who could switch moods without warning. As they grew older, the tension between the brothers became more obvious. Arguments turned into physical fights, fights turned into long periods of silence and resentment. Margaret, a school administrator by profession, tried to manage everything herself. She never involved outside support. Neighbors later said she always insisted that family problems stay inside the family. By the time Liam reached his early teens, things had escalated. He began skipping school, staying out overnight, and getting into trouble with local police for minor incidents. Caleb, meanwhile, withdrew further. He avoided social contact and spent most of his time at home or near the lake. At some point, authorities received anonymous complaints about conditions inside the Harrow home. When child welfare services finally visited, what they found raised immediate concern. The house was unusually bare for a family of 3. No personal decorations, minimal furniture. The boys' rooms were almost empty, with only mattresses on the floor and no visible belongings beyond clothing. Windows on the lower level were partially blocked from the inside, reducing visibility into the home. The most disturbing discovery was Liam's room. It had been modified with a heavy internal lock system and an external bolt. A small hatch had been installed in the door, clearly used to pass food through without opening it. The window was fully covered. Inside, the air was stagnant. Liam was present, but his behavior was defensive and tense. He did not appear fearful, but rather angry and withdrawn. Margaret explained the setup calmly. She said Liam had become uncontrollable, repeatedly running away and starting violent fights with Caleb. According to her, locking the room was a safety measure to prevent harm. Liam told a different story. He claimed he was being confined for long periods, sometimes days, with limited access to proper food and sanitation. He said his mother and brother both contributed to the abuse and that no one intervened when things escalated. The situation quickly became legally complicated. There were no clear external injuries at the time of inspection, but the living conditions and conflicting statements were enough for authorities to temporarily remove both children and detain Margaret for questioning. Then something unexpected happened. Caleb refused to support the allegations. He insisted his mother was not abusive but overwhelmed. He described Liam as dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of harming others without warning. He also claimed that many of the accusations were exaggerated or misunderstood. Because of Caleb's cooperation and lack of physical evidence, the case weakened. Margaret was eventually released, and the boys were placed into temporary care while the investigation continued. Liam was sent through multiple psychiatric evaluations and eventually placed in a residential treatment facility. Caleb was returned to his mother's custody after a court review determined there was insufficient evidence of abuse. For a time, the Harrow home returned to its quiet routine, but the atmosphere never truly recovered. Years passed. Caleb reached his late teens. Liam remained in and out of facilities, often disappearing from placements or being transferred due to behavioral issues. Contact between the brothers stopped entirely. By the time Caleb turned 17, he had become increasingly withdrawn and secretive. Neighbors later recalled seeing him walking alone at night near the lake, sometimes for hours. On evening June 14, 2019, everything changed. At around 6:30 p.m., Caleb called emergency services, his voice shaking. He reported that his mother had been injured inside the home. When responders arrived, they found Margaret Harrow in her bedroom with a severe head wound. An axe, taken from the backyard storage shed, was embedded in the injury. She was still alive when help arrived, but in critical condition. She was rushed to hospital, where she later died. Caleb was the only person present in the house. He told investigators that he and his mother had returned earlier that afternoon after attending a memorial service in a nearby town. According to him, they were both exhausted and went to rest separately. He claimed he fell asleep and woke up later to barking dogs and unusual noise outside. When he checked the house, he found his mother injured. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, the house showed no obvious struggle in shared areas. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies in Caleb's timeline. Phone data showed activity from his device during the window he claimed to be asleep. A neighbor also reported seeing him outside near the shed earlier that evening. When questioned again, Caleb admitted he had gone outside briefly to split wood after an argument with his mother. He said he returned inside, sat in the kitchen for a short time, and then discovered her shortly after. At first, there was no direct physical evidence linking him to the attack, no clear witness, no confession. But the case took a turn when digital forensic teams recovered Margaret's phone and several items from a nearby lake during a search operation. The devices had been disabled shortly before emergency services were called. The timing suggested the incident had occurred much earlier than initially believed. Then came a detail that shifted everything. Messages from Margaret's phone indicated she was active minutes before her death. At the same time, Caleb's phone data placed him moving between the house and backyard during that same period. What had seemed like a domestic incident began to look far more deliberate. As detectives prepared a second round of questioning, they received an unrelated update from state authorities. Liam Harrow, the younger brother, had been located in another state under a different identity following a separate arrest. He was in juvenile detention at the time of the incident and could not have been involved. That eliminated the primary alternate suspect. With pressure increasing and inconsistencies mounting, investigators moved to formally detain Caleb for further interrogation. He was taken in the following morning, and for the first time, the story of what really happened inside the Harrow home began to unravel. Once Caleb Harrow was formally taken into custody, the investigation shifted from suspicion to reconstruction. With Liam rolled out and no external suspect identified, detectives began focusing entirely on what had happened inside the house that evening. At first, Caleb maintained the same version of events. He insisted he had fallen asleep, that he woke up to noise, and that he discovered his mother injured without warning. But as investigators layered digital evidence, witness accounts, and timing data together, gaps in his account became harder to defend. Phone records showed activity during the exact time window he claimed to be asleep. His device had moved between the house, backyard, and shed area. A neighbor independently confirmed seeing him outside shortly before the emergency call was made. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Caleb adjusted his story. He admitted he had gone outside to split wood after an argument with his mother. He said it was routine, something he did to cool off. He maintained that when he returned, everything had already happened. But investigators were no longer focused on single statements. They were building a timeline. Inside the shed area, forensic teams recovered trace material consistent with recent use of tools. The axe itself had been cleaned, but microscopic traces of biological material were still detected. More importantly, the pattern of movement suggested the weapon had been accessed shortly before the incident. Then came the digital evidence that tightened the timeline further. Margaret's phone activity showed she had been messaging a friend shortly before the estimated time of the attack. The connection dropped abruptly. Within minutes, Caleb's phone activity spiked again, followed by the emergency call. The sequence suggested a narrow, controlled window rather than a random discovery. Still, investigators faced a challenge. There was no direct eyewitness and no confession. The case depended heavily on circumstantial alignment. That changed when Liam Harrow was formally brought in to testify after being located in a juvenile detention facility in another state. Records confirmed he had been in custody during the entire time frame of the incident, eliminating him completely as a suspect. His testimony was brief but consistent. He described a long history of escalating hostility in the household, particularly between Caleb and Margaret. He also confirmed what social workers had previously documented. The home environment had been unstable for years, with control issues, isolation, and unresolved conflict. However, Liam did not claim to have witnessed the incident itself. His statement simply reinforced the broader context of tension within the household. As investigators reviewed everything again, a clearer picture began to emerge. Margaret had been under financial strain and emotional stress. Caleb, now older and increasingly independent, had been in frequent conflict with her. Several neighbors recalled heated arguments in the months leading up to the incident, though none had reported them at the time. There were also earlier indications of breakdown in communication inside the home. Security systems had been disabled shortly before the incident. Cameras that had once been installed were no longer functioning. Margaret's phone, which she regularly used, had been shut off shortly before emergency services were called. The sequence suggested preparation, or at minimum, awareness of timing. When Caleb was confronted again, this time with a fully reconstructed timeline, his responses became less structured. He stopped repeating the same narrative and instead focused on emotional explanations. He described long-term resentment, feeling controlled, and years of conflict inside the household. Eventually, after multiple interviews and consultation with legal counsel, Caleb agreed to a formal statement. He did not initially confess to intent, but he acknowledged responsibility for the confrontation that led to his mother's death. According to his final version, the argument that day had escalated quickly. He described years of built-up tension finally breaking in a single moment. He admitted to using the axe during a confrontation in the backyard area, stating that the situation became physical and uncontrolled. He maintained that the act was not planned in advance, but occurred during a moment of emotional collapse. But investigators were cautious with this framing. While the presence of planning indicators existed, the absence of pre-event coordination made motive classification legally complex. The case would ultimately depend on interpretation of intent versus impulsive escalation. The forensic findings could not definitively establish whether Margaret was conscious during the entire sequence of injuries, but they confirmed that the force used was severe and deliberate in execution. The court process that followed focused heavily on mental state, intent, and the history of family dynamics. Prosecutors argued that Caleb had multiple opportunities to disengage, and the disabling of communication devices, combined with timing evidence, suggested a controlled progression of events rather than a spontaneous outburst. The defense countered that the environment inside the home had been emotionally unstable for years, emphasizing psychological strain, unresolved family conflict, and lack of external intervention. The absence of direct eyewitnesses meant the jury had to rely heavily on reconstructed timelines and expert testimony. In the end, the court reached a mixed conclusion. Caleb Harrow was not convicted of premeditated homicide, but was found guilty of a lesser form of unlawful killing tied to reckless and intentional force. The distinction reflected uncertainty about planning, but not about responsibility. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with eligibility for review after several decades. Liam was placed under long-term protective supervision as a witness and survivor of prior domestic instability. He did not return to the Harrow home. The Lake Renford property was eventually sold. Locals said the house remained empty for a long time afterwards, with overgrown grass and shuttered windows facing the water. What made the case linger in public memory was not just the crime itself, but how long it went unnoticed. A family that seemed ordinary on the surface had been slowly unraveling for years in ways most people never saw. And by the time anyone finally looked closely enough, the outcome had already been decided inside that quiet lake house. Some stories don't begin with a single moment of violence. They begin quietly, with small patterns that slowly grow into something darker, the kind of patterns people notice but don't fully understand until it's too late. Ethan Mercer was born on October 3, 1992, in a mid-sized town in Ohio called Fairbrook. At the time, his mother, Linda Mercer, was just 20 years old and still trying to finish college. Ethan's father had walked away before he was born, leaving Linda to face everything alone. The early months were filled with uncertainty. Linda worked part-time jobs, relied on help from relatives when she could, and tried to balance school with raising a newborn. But despite the stress, she was determined. She often said that the moment she first held Ethan, everything changed. Whatever fear she had disappeared, replaced by a single goal: to give her son a better life than she ever had. Not long after Ethan was born, something happened that would shape the way Linda raised him forever. When he was just a few weeks old, Ethan became seriously ill. What started as constant crying quickly escalated into a medical emergency. Doctors diagnosed him with a severe lung infection, and his condition deteriorated rapidly. He had to be transferred to a specialized children's hospital in another city, a trip that felt endless to Linda. Doctors warned her that the outcome was uncertain. They couldn't promise her that her son would survive. That moment broke something in her, but it also changed her. Linda spent those days in the hospital praying, making silent promises that if her son made it through, she would give him everything he ever needed. Ethan survived, and from that point on, Linda became deeply protective, almost to an extreme. She rarely told him no. If he wanted something, she found a way to give it to him. If he got upset, she avoided confrontation. To her, every moment felt like borrowed time, and she didn't want to risk losing his happiness. As Ethan grew older, people began noticing that something wasn't quite right. He wasn't like other kids. When he didn't get what he wanted, his reactions weren't just emotional, they were intense and unsettling. One incident stood out to Linda for years. While shopping one day, Ethan asked for a toy she couldn't afford at the time. When she tried to explain, he didn't cry or plead. Instead, he grabbed the toy and snapped it in half, then calmly picked up another one identical and told her he would break that one too if she didn't buy it. She gave in. Moments like that became more frequent. Ethan didn't like being touched, even by family. He refused to eat with his hands, insisting on using utensils for everything. He avoided playing with other children, and when they tried to approach him, his reactions could turn aggressive without warning. His way of playing was also unusual. He would line up his toys in perfect rows, step back, and just stare at them for long periods. He rarely engaged in imaginative play or interaction. Everything had to be controlled, precise. Social situations were difficult. He didn't respond to adults, ignored conversations, and often reacted with visible irritation when someone tried to engage him. Linda's friends found it unsettling, though most avoided saying anything directly. As the years passed, these behaviors didn't fade, they intensified. When Ethan was around 8, Linda met a man named Daniel Reeves. He was patient, outgoing, and believed in structure. When he entered their lives, he immediately noticed the lack of boundaries in Ethan's upbringing. Daniel wasn't harsh, but he was firm. He believed rules were necessary, especially for a child who struggled with limits. At first, he resisted him completely. One of the earliest clashes happened during their first Christmas together. Daniel had prepared everything: breakfast, gifts, a plan for the morning. He wanted them to sit together as a family before opening presents. Ethan had other plans. The moment he saw the gifts, he rushed toward them, but Daniel stopped him. He explained that they would eat first, then open presents together. Ethan refused. He sat at the table, but didn't eat. Minutes turned into hours. Even as the day passed, he remained there, unmoving, refusing to give in. Linda watched it all unfold. For the first time, she didn't step in. That night, Ethan went to bed without opening a single gift. But the next morning, when Daniel left for work, Linda broke. She gave Ethan the present anyway. He opened it, looked at it briefly, and without any visible emotion, threw it across the room, breaking it instantly. Linda was shaken, but instead of confronting him, she quietly replaced it. Daniel never found out. Over time, the tension between Ethan and Daniel grew worse. Arguments became constant. Ethan rejected any form of authority, and Daniel refused to back down. Linda found herself caught between them, unable to maintain balance. Eventually, the marriage collapsed. Daniel left. After that, things inside the house changed again, but not for the better. As a teenager, Ethan became increasingly isolated. He spent most of his time locked in his room. He didn't have friends, didn't socialize, and rarely left the house. When he did interact with his mother, it often turned into arguments. Linda tried to get him help. A psychologist evaluated him and diagnosed him with depression. Treatment was recommended, but Ethan didn't stick with it for long. For a while, it seemed like nothing would change. Then, unexpectedly, someone entered his life. Her name was Chloe Bennett. She was everything Ethan wasn't: outgoing, social, full of energy. She had friends, hobbies, plans for her future. When they met, no one really understood how the two connected, but somehow they did. And for a time, Ethan changed. He became more open, more expressive. He smiled more. He talked more. He even began showing affection, something Linda had rarely seen before. He told Chloe he loved her, words he had never once said to his own mother. Linda believed this was the turning point. She thought her son had finally found something that grounded him, something that would help him live a normal life. But the change didn't last. About a year into their relationship, Chloe became pregnant. Despite their young age, Linda supported them, even invited Chloe to move into their home. Neither of them had stable jobs, and both were still finishing school, but Linda believed they could make it work together. At first, they did. The house felt different. There was structure, routine, even moments of genuine warmth. When the baby was born, a healthy boy they named Noah, Ethan surprised everyone. He was attentive, careful, almost gentle. He took care of his son, fed him, played with him, stayed up at night when needed. For the first time, he seemed fully present. But slowly, almost unnoticed at first, things began to shift again. The control started small. Rules about cleanliness, rules about schedules, rules about how things should be arranged inside the house. Then the rules became stricter. Curtains had to stay closed at all times. Meals had to be prepared exactly how Ethan wanted. Chloe's movements were monitored. She could leave for work, but only within strict time limits. If she was late, even by minutes, arguments would follow. Linda tried to intervene, but Ethan shut her down immediately. The house no longer felt stable. It felt controlled. And then, one night, Linda walked into the kitchen and saw something that made her freeze. Ethan was sitting at the table, calmly cleaning a rifle. She didn't know where he got it. She didn't ask, because for the first time, she realized something she had never fully admitted before. She wasn't just worried about her son anymore. She was afraid of him. Everything began to unravel in the weeks after Leela left. At first, Ethan said very little. When Nadia told him that Leela had packed her things and gone, he simply sat down on the couch and stared at the floor. There was no shouting, no anger, no visible reaction at all. It unsettled Nadia more than any outburst could have. She expected rage, but instead, there was silence. Then came the shift. Ethan started pacing the house at odd hours, muttering to himself under his breath. He became increasingly fixated on his son, Noah, keeping him close at all times. He would watch him constantly, as if afraid someone might take him away. His behavior grew more rigid, more obsessive. Every door stayed locked. Every curtain remained closed. The outside world was no longer welcome. One evening, Nadia came home from work and found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, dismantling and cleaning a rifle. Her heart dropped. She had never seen that weapon before and had no idea where he got it. When she turned to leave the room, Ethan looked up and calmly asked, "Are you afraid of me?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. From that moment on, she avoided him whenever possible, retreating to her bedroom and keeping her distance. Fear had taken over her life. Not long after, Nadia had to undergo a minor surgery. When she returned home from the hospital, one of the first things she noticed was that their dog, Max, was gone. When she asked Ethan, he told her the dog had run into the road and been hit by a car. The explanation didn't sit right with her. Max had never been the type to run off like that, but Nadia didn't question him. She simply nodded and stayed quiet. By then, she understood something important. It was safer not to challenge him. Meanwhile, Leela had been rebuilding her life. Turning 18 gave her the freedom she needed. She quietly planned her exit, waiting for the right moment. One day, while Ethan was out, she packed her belongings and left the house for good. She made the difficult decision to leave Noah behind, believing that taking him might provoke Ethan into something far worse. Nadia knew about Leela's plan. She didn't stop her. In fact, part of her was relieved that at least one of them had escaped. When Ethan returned and learned Leela was gone, his reaction was chillingly calm. He said nothing, showed no emotion, and simply walked to his room. But something inside him had clearly snapped. In the days that followed, Nadia noticed him repeating the same phrase over and over again under his breath. Noah will never call another man father. It wasn't said in anger. It was said like a promise. On the morning of October 12th, Nadia left early for work. Ethan was already awake, pacing the living room with the curtains drawn tight. He was still repeating that same sentence. She tried to ask what was wrong, but he ignored her completely. Running late, she left the house, hoping things would settle down. That evening, after attending a support group meeting, Nadia returned home. The first thing she noticed was that Leela's car was parked in the driveway. For a brief moment, she felt hopeful. Maybe Leela had come back to talk. Maybe things could be resolved. But as she stepped inside, the silence hit her immediately. The house felt wrong. Then she saw it. Blood on the living room floor. Her heart started racing as she followed the trail down the hallway. It led straight to the bathroom door. It was closed, and from underneath she could see a thin line of dark red seeping out. Her hands shook as she pushed the door open. Inside the bathtub lay Leela, motionless, with a deep wound across her neck. She screamed and stumbled back, immediately calling emergency services while frantically searching the house for Noah. But he was nowhere to be found. Neither was Ethan. Police arrived within minutes. Paramedics confirmed what Nadia already feared. Leela was gone. With Ethan missing and the child unaccounted for, authorities issued an emergency alert. The situation escalated quickly. Every available unit began searching for him. The next morning, just after dawn, a breakthrough came. A hotel clerk recognized Ethan from the alert. He had checked in only hours earlier, accompanied by a small child. The clerk stayed calm, acted normally, and waited until Ethan went up to his room before contacting the police. Officers arrived quietly and surrounded the building. Ethan was arrested without resistance. Inside the room, Noah was found safe and unharmed. Ethan showed no emotion as he was taken into custody. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, and there were visible stains on his shoes. Investigators later confirmed that the evidence matched what had been found at the house. In the vehicle he used to flee, officers recovered the weapon. During questioning, Ethan remained mostly quiet, but he did make one request. He wanted to call his mother. When Nadia answered the phone, she could barely speak. Before she could say anything, Ethan apologized. He said he never meant for things to go that far, that he wished he could take it all back, that he was sorry. Then, for the first time in his life, he told her he loved her. It was a moment Nadia had waited years to hear, but it came at the worst possible time. The case never went to trial. Ethan accepted a plea agreement, admitting responsibility for what he had done. In exchange, he avoided a prolonged court process. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after decades. Leela was laid to rest days later. Her funeral was filled with grief, anger, and unanswered questions about how things had spiraled out of control so far. As for Nadia, she couldn't stay in that house. The memories were too heavy. She moved away, starting over in a quiet, isolated place where no one knew her past. She was granted custody of Noah. This time she raised him differently, with structure, with boundaries, and with the kind of balance she once struggled to find. She carried the weight of guilt every day, believing she could have done more, could have changed something. But she also carried a quiet determination. Noah's story, she promised herself, would not end the same way.